Hello, comrades. Good evening. Thanks for joining in this heat. Make the time for Why Marx. We're continuing to look at the question of communists and program, a hugely important question. Last week, we've had Jack Conrad with us, who looked at the relationship between party and program, and he outlined that everything flows from program in the communist point of view, and the organization flows from the program question, not the other way around. We're currently seeing, for example, the Corbyn party is doing it exactly the other way around, so they're going to do a program later sometime. Anyway, tonight we're going to look at some of our history again, from the Chartists to the socialist, the SPD's Erfurt program. We're doing this not because, we want to go over everything over and over and again. We have to learn some lessons, clearly. We have to see what maybe worked in our history, what needs updating, and so that we don't keep making the same mistakes over and over again. So there's a lot to be learned from the Chartists, I believe, and the Social Democrats in Germany. And looking at that history is Mike Macnair. He'll be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then, as always, we'll open up for questions and comments from the floor. Over to you. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Thank you, Tina, and for the invitation to speak on this. I should say that I'm speaking to something which broadly I've written an article on about 12 years ago called Program Lessons of Erfurt. I think it's probably worth also adding in a more recent one from 2020, which is covering a certain amount of the same ground. And in a sense, I've also talked about this in reviewing Bruno Leipold's book on republicanism, Marx and republicanism. The essence of this is going to be very roughly narrative. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about why the history is still relevant. So we start off with the question of the nature of political parties in general. And political parties in general start with the Tory party, which is originally an insult. Tory meant Irish Catholic rebel in the period 1678 to 1683, and the Whig Party, which was also originally an insult. Whig meant Scottish Protestant rebel. So the Tory and Whig parties are the original bourgeois political parties, because the Dutch regents operated a cooptative system and didn't have to run election campaigns, whereas in the English capitalist class, the parliamentary elections had members of the middle classes and in some constituencies of the lower classes able to vote, and they needed to make a relationship. And so we get actually these forms of political parties which take their organizational form in modern sense after the revolution of 1688. Rather, they emerge before the revolution of 1688. And the Whigs are the party which becomes, as it were, the principal leading party of the revolution. The Tories are the monarchist party, but then after 1688 you get a pro-revolutionary wing of the Tories, and the counter-revolutionary wing of the Tories get to be called Jacobites because they stand for the restoration of the House of Stuart. Okay, so these parties, they have the characteristic that you've got parliamentary caucuses, and quite a lot of historians' work have gone into tracing the actual existence of the Whig and Tory parliamentary caucuses, because a Tory historian in the 1930s, Lewis Namier, argued that they didn't exist, and it's now clearly understood that they did exist. There's parliamentary caucuses. Secondly, there's London clubs, and the London clubs um, form the relationship between sections of the capitalist class and the parliamentary caucus at national level. So the Kit Kat Club was a Whig political club. And there's another one, the October Club, I think it was a semi-Jacobite Tory political club. And then in the 19th century, the Reform Club was a liberal political club, and the Carlton Club was a Tory political club. And then you have political clubs of the same sort in the localities, which form the nexus of corrupt relationships between your local MP, but also your local councillors, the borough, the alderman, the mayor, and so on and so forth, and local business. And it's the local clubs which then are also the organisers of turning out the vote, among other things, by providing free booze and food for those who turned out to vote for the party, because we didn't have the secret ballot, and conversely organising the intimidation of people to not vote for the other side. And this form of national parliamentary caucus, national political clubs, local political clubs, is actually still the organisational form of the Tory party, though it's got a sort of constitutional structure within this, but spinally the Conservative clubs and the Conservative Unionist Central Office and the Parliamentary Party run the show. And it's still the form of the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States. And these parties are characteristically, they are ideological. Yeah. The Tory party is associated with Christianity, patriarchy, totus divisos ab orbo Britannos, the idea of British nationalism. Britain is fundamentally separate from the continent and should, that goes back to the reign of Queen Anne in 1702 to 1713. The Whigs, on the other hand, more engaged with Europe, more free marketeer, more liberal in relation to religious choice. They're the party which stands for the toleration of non-Anglicanism, whereas the Tories stood for the enforcement of Anglicanism. But at the same time, the Whigs and after them the Liberals are also the party of the repression of trade unions and of the working class. It's under Whig governments that an endless succession of legislation criminalising trade union activity in this industry, that industry, second industry, another industry, fourth industry is passed. It's under Liberal government in the 1830s that the new poor law is introduced to introduce the workhouse and to prevent local governments providing health services to people without putting them into the workhouse. Okay, so then these are the nature of the big bourgeois political parties. They have these vague general politics, but no very definite political commitments. And indeed, characteristically, they talk a big talk about, so both the Whigs and the Tories talk about constitutionalism when they're in opposition and are keen for liberty when they're in opposition, but when they get into government are keen to uphold the effective power of the executive, just as is also true similarly of the Republicans and the Democrats today. So they wear their ideological commitments lightly. Okay, now the workers' movement in the early 19th century is characterized by the existence of what is called sects or utopian sects. And the nature of these things is, again, um, they don't have program as such, but somebody writes a long theoretical book. Um, and so we have parties groups which are organized around the supporters of this long theoretical book. So Painites were the guys who organized around the ideas of Thomas Paine's common sense. Um, Spenceans organized around Thomas Spence's conception of communism. In the 1830s and 40s, we got Owenites based on Robert Owen's cooperativism. In France, Saint-Simonians, Fourierists, and from the late 1840s on, Proudhonists. So all of these, the essence of it, we've got a theoretical project, and people come in to support that theoretical project, but it remains the case there's always a whole load of different competing theoretical projects. Um, and that is broken out um, by the Chartists, who come up with, in 1838, there has been an attempt to organise general strike and mass trade unionism in the early 1830s, which fails. And the Chartists come up with a People's Charter, which is the People's Charter, of course, is the people's version of Magna Carta. It's based on, in that sense, the idea of a charter as foundational. And the People's Charter, 6 points: votes for all men over 21, the secret ballot, no property qualification for MPs, pay for MPs, constituencies of equal size, and annual elections. So actually, quite a lot of those are now with us. Annual elections, of course, isn't. Um, and Chartism is it's a platform, and that platform allows it to take off and become an enormous mass, very broad indeed, mass organisation through the 1830s and into the 1840s. The bourgeoisie counterattacks, and it counterattacks two sides actually. That the in an instant sense of to try and recapture what's trying to be done is to draw a line between the proletarians on the one hand and the lower middle class supporters of the charter on the other. And we get the repeal of the Corn Laws, which is the liberals' appeal to the working class to reduce um, uh, the cost of living by getting rid of agricultural subsidies. And then we get, in response to that, the Tories appeal to the working class with the 10-hour day act to set a limit on the maximum working day. But Chartism continues to be a big significant movement, and it's essentially broken by repression. In 1848, 1849, there's intense state repression of Chartism, and the movement is practically broken. The consequence of the fact that the movement is practically broken is that leftists forget uh, uh, that the significance of Chartism for Marx and Engels. And um, in fact, Engels does comment on this in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. And in 1846, Marx and Engels from Brussels had written to congratulate Fergus O'Connor on his election as Chartist MP. Communist Manifesto has a famous tag, which is endlessly quoted by Trotskyists and others against party organization, which is but quite mistakenly. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only. One, in the national struggles of the proletarians of different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. Two, in the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. That last sentence is almost invariably misread. The movement is in this text is Hegelianism, and it means the historical movement, the historical process which passes from capitalism to the dictatorship of the proletariat, or from localized class struggles to trade unions, from trade unions to political parties, and from political parties to the dictatorship of the proletariat. But also equally, what's meant by, quote, the other working class parties? The answer is, in fact, that it means just the Chartists and the American equivalent of the Chartists, the agrarian reformers. None of the other European leftist movements, not even Louis Blanc's La Réforme, which the Marxists were relatively close to by comparison with the Proudhonists. None of the others are characterized as working class parties. What they mean by working class parties, a party like the Chartists, that is to say, one which aims or organizes on a programmatic basis and aims for political power. And it's this character of the fact that the Communist League is in substance a ginger group within Anglo-American Chartism, which gives the shape that it has to the manifesto. Okay, part of this comes from the fact that Engels originally set out to write, quote, a communist catechism, which would be something slightly different. And part of it comes from the fact that Marx was the Communist League guys were in deep polemical engagement with Giuseppe Mazzini, Italian quote Democrat unquote. I say quote Democrat unquote because he was for universal suffrage, but he was also for universal suffrage with the right to elect only members of the great and the good, the aristocratic, and when he set up Roman Republic in the course of 1848, it was ruled by triumvirs, three men, a magistracy of three men, copied from the triumvirate of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus in the 50s BC, and that of Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus in the 40s to 30s BC. Okay, so the this character of the Communist Manifesto is not reflected when the communists come to set up the demand in 1848, once the revolution breaks out, the demands of the Communist Party in Germany. The demands of the Communist Party in Germany, signed off by Marx, Schapper, Bauer, Engels, Moll, and Wolff, 17 short points. The whole of Germany should be declared a single and indivisible republic. Male suffrage from the age of 21. Representatives to be paid. Universal arming of the people. Legal services to be free of charge. Abolition of feudal obligations. Princely and other feudal estates, together with mines, etc., to become state property. Mortgages on peasant lands to be state property, rent to be paid to the state as a tax, state bank to replace all private banks, means of transport to be taken over by the state, fixed equal salaries for civil servants, separation of church and state, curtailment of the right of inheritance, graduated income tax, national workshops to deal with unemployment, universal free education. So it's like it is a set of demands like Chartism and like the set of demands which there is at the end of the Communist Manifesto, but specifically adapted to the conditions in Germany. Okay, Chartism is defeated. The revolutions of 1848 are defeated. The workers' movement retreats dramatically, though there continues to be um, uh, uh, guerrilla struggles of the trade unions. There continues to be cooperative organization and so on and so forth. But it revives as a political movement around the movement in solidarity with the North in the American Civil War, involving the British trade unionists as well as the whole of one sort and another of the European left. And then out of the movement in solidarity with the North in the American Civil War, the next initiative is an initiative to try and create a movement in solidarity with the 1863 insurrection in Poland against the Russians. That is not a long-lasting insurrection. And what actually comes out of this is the launch of the First International in 1864. And First International isn't a program, it's a program producing organization, because quite a lot of what the International does is to discuss what working class policy on issue A or B or C or D should be. Quite a lot of what it does is just ordinary strike solidarity work, which it does actually more ordinary strike solidarity work proportional to its size and life than either the Second International or the Third International does. But it breaks up. It's witch hunted after the Paris Commune. The British trade unionists break. The Proudhonists, who were the other big component of the International, are massacred along with the Paris Commune, and a lot of them sent off to imprisonment overseas and so on. And there's a split between the Marxists on the one hand and the Bakuninists on the other about the question, should the working class intervene in elections? The Bakuninists argue that the working class should not intervene in elections. And going along with that, it's wrong to raise high political demands on high political questions. You have to focus on the social and on the general strike. And so on. In parallel, we've got two projects going on in Germany. The Lassallians, ADAV, General Association of German Workers, launched in 1863. It's sort of an odd organization because the actual program of the Lassallians is a document called the Open Letter, written by Ferdinand Lassalle to guys from the German trade union movement who'd come to him for advice on what trade unionists should do in politics. And so it's in that sense, the Lassallian, the ADAV, because the platform of the ADAV is a long pamphlet written by Lassalle, the Lassallians are like the Owenites or the Spenceans or the Fourierists and so on and so forth. It's an intermediate because what Lassalle argues the working class should do is first fight for universal suffrage, and then once you've got in universal suffrage, fight for state support for cooperatives. And state support for cooperatives will enable the end of exploitation as cooperatives replace capitalism. There's a history, which I have actually also written about, of the emergence of the alternative position, which is the Eisenach Party, which starts with Wilhelm Liebknecht joining the Lassallian organization, returning to Germany from working with Marx, joining the Lassallian organization, and arguing against Lassalle's friendly policy towards the conservative Prime Minister Bismarck, because Chancellor Bismarck because Lassalle's view was that the main enemy is the bourgeoisie, and therefore the conservative landed aristocracy and the monarchy are a legitimate ally against the capitalist employers. Bismarck has Liebknecht deported from Prussia because it doesn't fit with Bismarck's wish to use Lassalle against the liberals. And Liebknecht goes off to Saxony and constructs a liberal party called the left liberal party called the Volkspartei, the People's Party, along with August Bebel. And then the Volkspartei, there's a split from the ADAV, which is about the anti-democratic functioning of the ADAV rather than about politics. But the splitters join with Bebel and Liebknecht on the basis that Bebel and Liebknecht break up the Volkspartei alliance with the left liberals, and they form the Eisenach Party. And the Eisenach Party is a return to the pattern which is there in Chartism and is there in the demands of the Communist Party of Germany, of a party which is founded not on a elaborate theoretical construction, but on the basis of a outline general conception of the future and a set of concrete and specific demands, which again have political demands as prominent as economic demands. After this, there's again I have written about this, but there's a to and fro between the Lassallians and the Eisenachers, in particular, actually, because Bebel and Liebknecht, as deputies in the North German Parliament, refused to vote for. They abstain on the issue of war credits for the Prussian war against France. Which leads to them getting thrown into jail, and actually the rest of the leadership of the Eisenach Party getting thrown into jail. But then when it becomes transparent that this is actually a war of aggression by Germany disguised as a war of aggression by France, the fact that Bebel and Liebknecht took a principled stand where the Lassallian leadership had actually said, defend Germany, victory to Germany, results in increased, in the medium term, in increased political authority of the Eisenachers. It's still the case that when they fuse, the Lassallians have about 12 or 13,000 members, and the Eisenachers about 7,000. So it's the Lassallians are a bigger organization. And the Gotha program, which is the program of the fusion in 1875, contains, as in fact the Eisenach program does, extensive concessions to Lassalle's theory of state-backed cooperatives, and also to Lassalle's nationalism, which was Marx and Engels. One of Marx and Engels' sharpest criticisms of Lassalle was that he was not an internationalist, and that the Lassallean organization didn't back the First International. And the upshot at the end of the day, 1875, they fuse on the basis of the Gotha program. It's got major concessions to the Lassallians, but at the same time, it also has the character of the Eisenach program. It's got a series of democratic demands and a limited series of economic demands. It's a program of the same sort as demands of the Communist Party of Germany and the 6 points of the Charter. In that sense, it's that sort of a program. So that the Lassallians have massively conceded to Bebel and Liebknecht have made ideological concessions to the Lassallians, but the Lassallians have made utterly fundamental concession. Instead of this being a party based on the theory of Lassalle, it's become a party based on a short summary political program. And then we get, in spite of Marx and Engels' criticisms of the democratic elements in the Gotha program, as they say, is just a repeat of the standard liberal stuff. That, incidentally, is in Marx's plagiarized from Bakunin's critique of the Eisenach program. It's fair enough to plagiarize Bakunin's critique of the Eisenach program because this stuff was in the Eisenach program, but at the same time, when Marx comes with Lafargue and Guesde to draft the program of the Parti Ouvrier, the French Workers' Party, in 1880, we get a short preamble by Marx which states the fundamental general aims of communism. I think it's still brilliant, frankly, still better than an awful lot of modern statements of the general aims of socialism or communism. But also then a political section, which is a section of political demands, and an economic section, which is a section of economic demands, which is things like the workers should no longer have to have a positive reference from their former employer to get a job, or rather, you had to be released. You had to have a formal testimonial from your prior employer in order to even apply for a job. The lands of the Catholic Church should be the lands which are said to be Mortmain should be returned to the public. That is to say that the assets of the Catholic Church should be expropriated and become public property. The program of the Parti Ouvrier, the preamble of the program of the Parti Ouvrier is then expanded somewhat to form the first part of the Heinfeld program. The Heinfeld program is the program of the Austrian social democracy adopted when we get a regroupment of a series of different socialist groups in Austria-Hungary in 1889, and they're unified on the basis of the Heinfeld program. And the Heinfeld program is the preamble is based on but expanded from the preamble of the Parti Ouvrier, and we again get a series of political demands and a series of economic demands of contingent character of one sort and another. Okay, so then, meanwhile, the effect of the Gotha unification, we start with these two groups of 13-odd thousand and 7-odd thousand. Which have gone up and down. They haven't sort of massively grown over the period. The repression has hit them after 1875, but the 1870, but the 1875 unification leads to an enormous growth, and suddenly the tens of thousands of members, the SAPD, as it's called, Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, is winning elections all over the place. The bourgeoisie panics and illegalizes the SAPD in the anti-socialist laws in 1878. But they don't illegalize them standing for election. It's still possible to stand for election as a, quote, socialist, independent socialist, whatever the hell you like to call it. And the SAPD guys continue to organize through printing a newspaper in Switzerland and smuggling it into the country through Vertrauensmänner, trusted men who are appointed by the party leadership to do the clandestine work of smuggling the stuff into the country. And the ability of the parliamentary fraction to make public statements, and the ability of people in the localities. Obviously, you can organize every time there's an election, you can organize a constituency organization. You're allowed to organize constituency organizations to campaign, but you're not allowed to organize more extensively than that. And by 1890, it's clear that the effort to crush the German social democracy by repression has failed. The party is legalized, and in 1890 it sets up its organizational form, and in 1891 it goes about redrafting its program. And the Erfurt program is an initial draft by Wilhelm Liebknecht, which is actually quite close to the Gotha program, and then a series of amendments. The first initial, the opening part of it, the general theoretical part of it, is redrafted by Karl Kautsky with a lot of direction from Frederick Engels. And in the course of the process, Kautsky publishes the critique of the Gotha program in the Neue Zeit magazine, which is regarded as being an outrage by Wilhelm Liebknecht and Hasselmann and co., who had been involved with the Gotha program. You can see in Engels' correspondence that he says these guys won't talk to me, refuse to talk to me because Marx and I were so rude about them in 1875. Never mind, it just means there's less correspondence for me to deal with. Yet they'll come out of it at the end of the day. And so we get this pattern. And the Heinfeld program, the Erfurt program, we get a similar, the program of the Parti Ouvrier, this pattern of programs in which the idea is that the working class takes power through political democracy, and that it puts forward a series of economic demands which are immediately posed, but the economic demands which are immediately posed are steps on the road to a future socialization. Steps on the road to a future socialization, and the the effect of this is just as Chartism, the 6 points of the Charter, allowed you to go beyond theoretical grouplets around Owenism or Spenceanism or Paineism, or to go around beyond. So the method of the demands of the Communist Party of Germany and of the Eisenach and Gotha programs and of the Heinfeld program of the Parti Ouvrier opens up the road to a political party which adds something beyond, which offers an alternative legitimacy to the claims of the capitalist state to legitimacy in a way in which trade unions and cooperatives on their own don't. And it is also because it's founded on a set of fairly short concrete demands, a general perspective and a set of fairly short concrete demands. It's possible to have a party on the basis of the acceptance of the program. It doesn't have to be Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, because Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought is in reality a thing of the same sort as Lassalleanism and as the same sort as Owenism and Spenceanism and so on, and just as true of Cliffism. It's the cult, all of these forms of the cult of the personality. Why do we need this is step two. I'm not going to say very much because I've spent more time than I meant to, but at the end of the day, The working class needs to take political power. To take political power requires that the soldiers should cease to, usually the police officers usually run away because they made themselves so unpopular that they relatively only a small minority, like the guy Rovio who protected Lenin in July 1917. Only a small minority of police officers carry on, but the army has to turn their weapons on their officers. As long as the army isn't turning their weapons, as long as the army remains core, the loyalty of the army to the existing constitution continues. The capitalist state retains control, and the capitalists, we've seen this actually very clearly in Egypt in the Arab Spring. The intact character of the capitalist army meant that however many people there were on the street and however much mobilization and enthusiasm and so on and so forth, the army can take back power. And the same is true, of course, of the difference between Russia in 1917, where the loyalty of the army to the state was destroyed, and Germany in 1819, where the Hindenburg-Ludendorff the German High Command were able to keep the Western Front and Eastern Front, although the garrison troops went over to the revolution in Berlin and Kiel and so on. The Western Front and Eastern Front armies remained loyal to their high commands. And the absence of disloyalty, of the creation of disloyalty among the armed forces to the high commands, means that you can't, the working class can't take power. The working class needs its own armed forces loyal to it. In order to do that, it needs its own constitutional conceptions, which are sufficiently attractive to broad masses that they can reach into and undermine the loyalty of the soldiers to the bureaucrats and so on and so forth to the existing state constitution. It's that democratic, it's the democracy first conception, which is Marx's, clearly Marx's conception, which enables the possibility of levering apart and breaking up the state apparatus and the working class taking political power. Conversely, however, suppose we have Soviets, workers' councils, and run by a bureaucratic. Suppose we have workers' councils run by a political party which is loyal to the capitalist class. That's the situation in Germany in 1919, and indeed in Austria in 1919. The guys running the councils restore the power of the capitalist class. Suppose we have Soviets run by a bureaucratic party which is bureaucratic centralist, which breaks with, as the Bolsheviks did in 1918, broke with the principles of revolutionary democracy, not by the fact that they forced through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk as a minority, which is legitimate emergency decision making, but by the fact that at the 1919 Congress of Bolshevik Party and in the first and in second Congress of Comintern, they theorized minority dictatorship as being the natural form of dictatorship of the proletariat. By doing that, they created political parties which were incapable of breaking up the state, except in the case where there's a mass peasant, where what you've actually got is a country which is predominant peasant country, and you can win by prolonged People's War, which in a sense is what happened in 1918 to 21 in the Russian Civil War, that the Bolsheviks put themselves at the head of the peasantry as a collective Bonaparte, but far more clearly true of the Vietnamese Communist Party, of the Chinese Communist Party, of the Vietnamese Communist Party, and so on, down to actually until rather recently the Nepali Communist Party. But we haven't got these peasant majority countries with pre-capitalist states. Pretty hard to find relevant ones these days. And the working class as a class needs political democracy. It needs political democracy in order to do effective planning. It needs political democracy in order to hold the state bureaucracy in subordination. The idea that the existence of Soviet substitutes for that is an illusion. So that Erfurt, the programmatic frame of Erfurt, is the programmatic frame which enabled there to be Bolshevism, but also actually all the mass communist parties. It's not the ideas of Luxembourg and the German left, which were the basis of that. That's all.
Thank you very much, Mike. Very much. There's quite a lot in that introduction. So thank you very much, comrades. If you have any questions or comments, please click raise hand, and I can make you a panelist. A few questions now to you to get the ball rolling. So you outlined through all these different programs that they had different lengths, they had different purposes, were put together by different sets of peoples, but they had always like a political part of it as well as an economic part, and often started with saying what we actually want, where we're going to, a maximum part. How do you compare that to what much of the left is doing today, and why do you think much of the left does not seem to have any interest in learning the lessons from that? Do they use 1914, the collapse of the international, into nationalism and in the breakout of the war? Is that a reason? Is the minimum maximum program dismissed for that reason? And do you think that holds up, or is it? And I know it doesn't hold up. You don't think it doesn't hold up. Why do you think that they, almost all of them, don't accept that the minimum maximum program, as developed by Marx, etc., has us something to teach us?
I'm going to go as quickly as possible. The argument that the minimum program is obsolete, or that the minimum program is superseded by the open struggle for power, is made by Trotsky in Lessons of October in 1907. And the point which Trotsky is making is that suppose you try and implement the minimum program, the capitalists will go on strike. They're not prepared to accept the 8-hour day. They'll run away. We know that, actually. It's perfectly obvious. It's true even of the very minimal reform proposals of the Hollande government in France in 2011, 2012, à 40 euro meter. It's just normal practice of the capitalists to withdraw their capital unless they get what they want. Okay, so Trotsky then says, then the consequence of that, we can't combat that withdrawal of capital without expropriations, which is also true. And therefore, that means that the difference between the minimum and the maximum program is gone, which is wrong, because expropriations by a state is not the maximum program. The maximum program is a classless, stateless society. He's confused the maximum program with just extensive nationalizations. Okay, so then step 2, I don't know how far back Luxembourg goes, but Parvus argues that the minimum program is misconceived because it demands democracy, and that's to run your head up against Parvus Alexander Helfand, aka Israel Lazarevich. For some reason, we have no idea what his actual surname was. We've just got his first name and his patronymic. Russian names, first name, father's name, surname. We don't know what the hell Parvus's surname was. Parvus is a pseudonym. Alexander Helfand is a pseudonym. Anyhow, Parvus argues in 1914, well, he argues in 1912 that you need to cut down on the democratic stuff because if we go for economic planning as the center of the program, we can win over sections of the middle classes who understand that capitalism is already logically moving towards um, cartels and monopolies. Yeah. And in 1914, Parvus argues that it's because the uh, uh, social democracy passively insisted on fighting for the democratic element of the minimum program and not entering into coalitions that it's rendered useless. And the essential thing is for the social democracy now to get in on side and back the German war effort, because that's what's needed in order to not be passive. Um, Luxembourg actually runs arguments which I think are her own, but also borrowed from Parvus in December 1918. As she says, the minimum program is obsolete. It's the same sort of argument as Trotsky, essentially, that the maximum program is seen as just being nationalizations. Um, and that stuff is all set on one side because Parvus, of course, he's on his way out of the workers' movement. He becomes simply an agent for a guy called Stinnes, who was a steel magnate for agitating for the European unification. Luxembourg is killed. Um, the maximum program only line is denounced by Lenin, and is sort of seen as being connected with the ultra-leftism of the Spartakists in January 1919 and of the 1921 March action. Because certainly the guys who argued for the March action, like Lukács and Ruth Fisher, and that tendency, argued that the minimum program is obsolete and superseded, and so on and so forth. Then, okay, this may seem to be this is just a German story. It is actually partly a Russian story because Bukharin and his co-thinkers in the left communists argued that the minimum program is superseded. And that then comes up in the Fourth Congress of Comintern, that the minimum program, the argument is the minimum program is superseded, results in the Russian delegation is split over arguments that we should use the minimum program made by Thalheimer and others in Germany. And the Russian delegation being split, they fudge, they reach a fudged agreement whereby instead of calling the demands minimum demands, they call them transitional demands. And it's this fudge in 1922, which is inherited by the Trotskyists. It's obscured in the first place because Bukharin in the draft program for the Sixth Congress of Comintern gave the transitional program a completely different meaning, which is a program for workers' economy, mixed economy under a workers' dictatorship. In any case, the point is that the German stuff then gets resurfaced. There's a whole series of guys, Peter Nettle, Leonard Shapiro, Karl Schorska, Leo Valiani. There are others who are MI6 or OSS in the late 1940s, who appear in the academy in the 1950s and 1960s, arguing that the truth about Germany was that the only real option was the choice between the argument of Bernstein for coalitionism and reformism and the arguments of Luxembourg, which were romantic but doomed. And equally said Trotsky's romantic but doomed. The only realistic choice is therefore Bernsteinism. But the left, in general, has picked up and accepted the arguments of Nettle and Shorska, and Nettle and Shorska in particular. Shaparo less so because he's more sort of history of the CPSU person, and Valiani because he's an Italian and writing in Italian, so there's less of it. But the left has picked up and accepted these arguments. And what we get out of it actually is, quote, transitional method as an alternative to having a program. And indeed, Tony Cliff actually argues explicitly you shouldn't have a program. Neil Faulkner, writing not long before his death, 5 years ago, you shouldn't have a program. It's the idea that you should have a program is the sectarian poison which results in the left being so splintered.
Could you then quickly define what's in the minimum program, what's the maximum program?
Well, the maximum program is the general aim of communism, the aim of getting beyond class society, getting beyond the state, collective action. The minimum program is, in the first place, a set of political demands which would have the effect, or believed to have the effect, that this would amount to the overthrow of the capitalist state, that if the whole of it is put into effect, you'd overthrow the capitalist state, and the working class would take political power. But at the same time, there's also a set of economic demands. Marx says of the ones in the Parti Ouvrier, these are ones which have arisen from the class itself. This is actually also true of quite a lot of the stuff which is in the immediate demands in the CPGB's draft program. That, you know, it's not the case that we came up with this stuff, pull this stuff out of our heads. It's largely stuff which has come out of demands raised by the workers' movement itself, the economic elements of it. Yeah.
But technically, they are. You could put them into.
So that the point is, yes, in theory, that in essence, that you can implement all of this stuff without abolishing money. Whereas the sliding scale of wages, sliding scale of hours, which Trotsky proposes in 1938, if you actually implemented it, it amounts to the immediate abolition of money, because sliding scale of wages, sliding scale of hours means we just share out the work among everybody. Sliding scale of wages, however, we are saying that your wages are going to be paid on the basis of a basket of which the Workers' Council decides what's in the basket, a basket of goods. So actually, in order to do that, if you do that, you've immediate money. It's no longer money, because the basket of goods is defined by the workers' councils. So that in fact, what you're proposing is the immediate introduction of rationing as an alternative to money, but it's not transparent that that's what's happening in the sliding scale of wages demand. So that it's in that sense, yeah. So the point is the minimum program. We aren't going to get rid of the petty bourgeoisie all at once. So we have to be able to continue to use money to trade with the petty bourgeoisie. So the minimum program, therefore, is a set of the stuff which is in there is given by what's objectively needed. Yeah. But it's defined in a way that it's not the complete abolition of private property and money. It's a set of demands in the interests of the working class, which hold the capitalist class in unequivocal subordination. And so, for example, in relation to small businesses, you know, our program says small businesses will be obliged to pay the minimum wage. We're not going to make small business exceptions in relation to the minimum wage. We're not going to make exceptions for children in relation to being paid the minimum wage. or working hours. So there's a young woman who I taught when I was at Leeds who had problems with her time at uni because she had to work in her parents' newsagents every day for god awful hours. So that sort of, it's the imposition of the interests of the working class, holding the interests of the capitalist class and also the interests of state bureaucracy and subordination, thereby creating the conditions for moving beyond that towards the general goal, which it gets rid of the state and the whole lot of it. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. Satish, please.
Hello, Mike. I hope you can hear me. What I was going to ask you is if you could give a little information about earlier struggles of the working class, such as Luddism, the Blanketeers, the swing riots in particular, as the 1830s, which the swing riots were in, was a particularly militant decade in British history, and also referred to what happened after the swing riots, i.e., the Merthyr Rising during it, and the Newport Rising, the Rebecca riots, and that actually led into Chartism. So it's all part of a big, big struggle, and the reaction to them, to these things, and how or if Marx and Engels opposed such grave injustices as happened in the Merthyr Rising to Dick Penderyn, where 11,000 people marched in support of him to oppose the plan to execute him. It didn't succeed. He was executed, and he clearly shouldn't have been. There was also massive transportation of the working class, which happened in all of these struggles, and that there were similar issues over the swing riots. So I was just wondering if you knew whether Marx and Engels in particular had actually said anything about this.
Thank you. Mike, do you want to want me to take somebody else, or do you want to answer this? You're muted, sorry. Sorry, Mike, you're muted. I didn't catch that.
Yeah, I'll take somebody else because that's a shortage point. Then I'll come back
Okay.
after one or two more.
Rafal, please.
Hello. Thank you for the talk, Mike and Tina. I'd like to hear Mike expand on the question of the minimum program demand for a popular militia, since he raised the question of the necessity of ensuring the loyalty, at least a section of the army, of dividing the army. Obviously, that is an essential question for the working class to be able to take power. But that is difficult with a professional military as we have in Britain at the moment. It's easier when you have a conscripted army with more general cross-section of the population, including the working class, represented in it. That's much more fertile ground for a communist party. But since presumably we can't implement, there's little chance of implementing a popular militia until the Communist Party does in some way come into power, whether that's in a coalition on the basis of the minimum program or winning a majority. How does the Communist Party go about winning the loyalty of the army before a popular militia? You know, in history, we've seen Communist parties form military organizations, the Tudeh in Iran, the PDPA in Afghanistan, who actually did it successfully. To some extent, the Portuguese Communist Party and the MFA. So yes, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the popular militia and the question of the army. Thank you.
Good question. Mike, I wonder when you're answering that, also the question of the state within a state, which you sort of briefly mentioned as a key objective for the Social Democrats in building up our own democratic structures, our own democratic organizations. I wonder if you could touch upon that as well within the question of the army. You did mention them together in your introduction. I suggest you come in now, and then we have a couple more people.
Okay, Satish, this stuff, there's a long fucking history of this. The first anti-union legislation is the Confederacies of Masons Act, 1425. And all through the 18th century, there's a massive succession of anti-union laws of one sort and another. I've studied myself. There's a case where the judiciary invents law called the case of the journeyman tailors of Cambridge in 1721, where they say that conspiracy to raise wages is a crime. And they say this on the basis that an agreement to do anything is a crime. So extraordinary piece of judicial legislation. And then by the 1730s, we've got a precedent of an indictment for conspiracy to refuse to work more than 16 hours a day, to the great loss and damage of the employer. And this stuff is going on, being enforced all through the 18th century. I agree. Ned Ludd, it's the chronology is slightly different. Ned Ludd is machine breaking as a tool of class struggle. And of course, the thing of its being Ned Ludd is something which goes back to the peasants' revolts that we have pseudonymous. It's pseudonymous leaders. But it certainly, yes, Ned Ludd then leads to a temporary legalization of trade unions in 1825 on the basis that they say, well, the laws, Ricardo's work shows that the laws of economics will force wages down to subsistence levels anyhow. So we don't need to criminalize trade unions, but very rapidly the guys do indeed want to criminalize trade unions. And so criminalization of trade unions returns, and we get to, yes, Captain Swing is endeavors to unionize and to organize agricultural workers, the Blanketeers, Merthyr Uprising, etc. I think there's probably some comment on some of this. There's certainly some comment of various sorts from Engels. How much there's comment from Marx, I don't know, because Engels is the guy who has more personal knowledge of English politics and of the English Labour, British politics, the British Labour movement. But Engels' condition of the working class in England is, again, it's sort of, there's an element of, but it's there. The issue, in a sense, is that Chartism represents a shift away, and it represents a shift away because of the defeat of the strikist perspective. The strikist perspective, the mass struggle, the sort of direct actionist perspective is defeated, but it doesn't go away. It's present within the Chartist movement, and it, as you say, Rebecca and Merthyr Uprising and all of that stuff. Popular militia, universal arming of the people. The short answer to this is yes, we can. It is in principle possible to win all of this stuff under capitalism because, hey, look, the Swiss armed forces are organized on the militia basis. The right of public right to bear arms is in the US Constitution. The extraordinary level of disarmament of the working class, much greater than it was in the 19th century, is product of firearms legislation, which was originally introduced against the workers' movement, because of the Bolshevik threat in the 1920s. If we were large enough, yes, we would, and indeed actually quite small organizations, the French Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire, the Portuguese Liga Comunista Internacionalista, the Mandelaite organizations organized clandestine work in the armed forces, though it was easier to do that because it was conscript armed forces. It's primarily a question of creating enough of a political climate that the political climate reaches into even a volunteer armed forces. And if the political climate reaches into the armed forces, then you're going to get the issue of the soldiers refusing to obey their orders is going to begin to show up, but also people beginning to organize. We can see it actually in another example, the anti-war movement in the anti-Vietnam War movement in the United States. The United States, at the end of the day, pulled troops out of Vietnam and went for Vietnamization because its armed forces were falling apart due to the level of class conflict and racial conflict within the armed forces as a result of the strength of the workers' movement. So the demand for a popular militia is our political alternative to professional and universal military training. Again, a sort of I went to bourgeois public school, and this is in the 1960s. Everybody had to be in the school cadet force and learn how to shoot. I was taught how to shoot a Longley Enfield 303 and a Bren gun and 9mm pistol and other such kit, and do various stuff of this sort, and you had to actually specifically opt out on conscientious grounds if you didn't want to do that. So nothing to stop. This is Engels's project, was that there should be universal military training in schools. If the bourgeoisie can do universal military training in schools for the upper classes, don't see why we can't fight for universal military training in schools more generally. State within a state. This is it's actually a characterization, negative characterization of the SPD and of the PCI, Italian Communist Party, at the time when they weren't fully reformistized, as it were. And the point being simply that it's not the business of the party. The party needs to build up not just a party. It's not just a political action. The party needs to support trade unions, but also to build up cooperatives, workers' cycling, workers' athletics, workers' cycling clubs, workers' music, workers' drama, workers' education, all of these things. Actually, the old CPGB did a fair amount of this sort of work, even though it was a small party. It's only because of the radical syndicalism of the Trotskyists left, that they don't, in spite, they don't do that sort of work. We, of course, CPGB, we're not really in a position to do that sort of work because we're just too small. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. Ian, please. If you could switch on your camera. Thank you.
Good evening, Mike, and thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. Greetings from a sunny Durham. How often do you get to say that?
Sunny Durham, yeah.
A couple of footnotes on the popular militia and so on. As you know, I was in the Army Reserve for 12 years. But what we see in the armed forces across the piece really is a net outflow. That nobody wants to do it. The idea of introducing universal military service, from that point of view, seems somewhat abstract. Of course, under different circumstances, where you've got an overall radicalization of the general population, very different. But there is absolutely, I mean, in a sense, it's almost a relatively moderate suggestion to have universal military service, because after all, I remember once having this discussion, and somebody else came on and said, "Well, it's not like, you know, rifles and what have you. It's submarines and fighter planes. Who do you think bloody flies them? You know, it's not it's not card-carrying members of the bourgeoisie that fly F-35s. It's these ordinary workers who are trained up to do it." So the other thing I would just like to say as a kind of a optimistic point, although there is a kind of net outflow from the armed forces because no one wants to do it because it's increasingly badly paid, the bourgeoisie actually don't seem to care about their armed forces. But what we've got now really is a kind of capital intensive armed forces where, for example, flying a drone, skills which of course one learns playing Call of Duty or whatever else, is now an actual part of the service in the British Army. I worked with people who worked for the Royal Artillery, and they were literally doing flying drones, using those skills they learned playing Call of Duty for targeting artillery barrages. So it's quite an extraordinary kind of development. So in a sense, there is a kind of generalizing of certain sorts of military skills. What there isn't is a generalizing of things like how to hold a rifle or whatever. But when you consider the likelihood of a revolutionary struggle taking the form of barricades on the street, it's not very. It's going to take a somewhat different form. What seems to be completely absent certainly in the British left is starting to understand that we might be moving into a position where we are going to have to start thinking about what it will be like to work underground. Because although I don't think, you know, fascism is just around the corner and Trump's going to stamp on everything and all of a sudden the whole world is going to fall apart, I think there may well come a point where even in Britain you might be looking at a situation where the left will have to learn to work underground. And that is something quite different to anything of my generation has known. And I think the sooner we start that, the better. But thank you for an excellent presentation. It's been fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Ken, please.
Right. Thank you very much, Mike, for that presentation. My question is a more general one, and it's across the way in which
Oh, Ken. I think he's stuck. Not
Oh
sure.
dear.
Oh. Try again. You're back now. I'll switch your video off. That sometimes helps. Try again, please.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, my question is how left groups have communicated their programme over the period you've covered, and how far that has changed and evolved, and how successful any of those changes have been. I mean, originally, one assumes communication might have been done verbally because there wasn't much availability of printing and there wasn't much literacy. As literacy improved, how far did the communication depend on circulation of documents? How far did people have specific meetings to explain their programming? And what other changes were there across the, a couple of centuries, say, in the way that the program was communicated outside of people, who weren't already in the movement, as it were? Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Mike, we've got two more people with their hands up. Do you want to answer now or take them first?
I think take them, and I'll come back after that.
Okay, doc. And please.
Hi, can you hear me? Am I there?
Always.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tina. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure someday we'll meet up and we'll hug. I would like to say that, okay, I'm not going to go over the same old over and over and over again. You know where, we of the, communist left, if you want to use that term, we don't particularly like it. We were the left opposition to Stalinism. I think we all are. We don't support any bourgeois state formation, national liberation, lesser evils, or any of that sort of thing. But I'm not going to go into all that. I want to ask something quite specific. I think Lenin. I think we all like a bit of Lenin. Lenin wrote, "A democratic republic is the best possible political shell for capitalism." And he also went on to write a few lines later, "It establishes its power so securely, so firmly, that no change of persons, institutions, or parties in the bourgeois democratic republic can change it." Marx also eventually came to the conclusion that we cannot simply take hold of the state. So in one way, some of the earlier anarchist critiques were founded, but I think Marx self-corrected, and self-corrected well, and we see later on. But the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made machinery and wield it for its own purposes. So, as I understand it, I think that the CPGB agree that at some point in time, and I think what Ian said is completely relevant to what I'm trying to say. At some point in time, the gloves will come off. So, however that happens, the gloves will come off, and it will come down to violence, and likely, as Mike says, does the army stand, or do whatever forces of repression exist come over to our side, or do they remain loyal? But I want to ask a very, very specific question. What is the foundation for saying that the working class cannot organize and topple capitalism, regardless of the political mask worn by the ruling class dictatorship? I heard from someone, but not of this organization, so I'm going to try and be fair, who were saying that better that the Ukrainians win the war against Russia, and that will establish a democratic republic, and the working class can thereby better organize to overthrow capitalism. But I'm going to argue that or at least I'm going to ask, yes, why do we need this democratic shell? Why is it so necessary? Why do we need to talk in terms of some sort of stage where we get rid of the monarchy, House of Lords, etc.? I think that if the working class puts this system under threat, and exactly in the in the way that Ian said, then the veneer of democracy, rights, and rule of law, and all anything of that nature will be put to one side, and the ruling class will attempt, might not achieve it, but will attempt to do whatever it takes to maintain the reality of its class dictatorship. I think there's no avoiding the creation of independent, self-created working class organs. Because at some point in time, as I say, the gloves will be off and the democratic pretense will be gone. And so, a significant layer of the class has to be involved in these class-wide organs. And we also need, as I think that Mike will agree, a political organ which is advocating the power of the working class. So I see the political organ advocating the power of these class-wide organs. Any other formulation won't work. So the class-wide organs in themselves are not sufficient. But I think these class-wide organs that gather the working class in general, at least a significant part of the working class, will have to stand up against a state willing to drown a revolution in blood. I think it could be argued, I'm not arguing myself, but it could be argued that revolution is facilitated by an overtly dictatorial capitalism. For example, Italy 1943. In Italy 1943, under Mussolini, and I think that this strike was led by the Italian Communist Party, or at least it shakily began by the Italian Communist Party. So on March 5th, 1943, epicenter in the Fiat Mirafiori plant, there was a strike, and within a week, over 100,000 workers were out on strike. That occurred under fascism. Yes. So, and what about the various struggles under Stalinism? Hungary, Poland, 1980. I know none of them became revolutionary. Yes, but a revolution is a very, very difficult thing. I think so far we've only had one revolution. 1917. That's it. We had one attempt at world revolution. No more. Historically, and this is going back to what Mike was saying, so completely relevant, I believe. The British working class, in conditions of repression, death penalty, transportation, whatever, an ugly situation, put the system under threat, demanding a radical democracy with annual parliaments, as you said, Mike. And whatever the shortcomings of the movement, it's obvious that the real aim is not for some sort of, some ideal political scheme. It's the elimination of the horrific conditions imposed on the working class. They had no legal rights and representation, but they're still organized, and the ruling class trembled. And I'm going to stop. I'm going to let you, if there's anything that you can add to what I'm saying. But I think that all the talk about democratic rights and stages which involve sort of like conquest of political power within the context of a bourgeois republic. Are not a necessity for the working class, and in fact, at least, a double-edged sword, enabling the ruling class to contain an otherwise revolutionary class. Okay, Mike, hopefully I've been reasonable. Thank you very much.
Gershom, please. Gershom, can you hear us?
Hear me?
Oh, yes, there you are.
Okay, so very briefly, I wanted to respond to the point on the sliding scale of wages and hours, because this is not the first time that I've seen Mike, I think, make a rather drastic misreading of history. And, Peter Taft or Tony Cliff may have written all sorts of things later. But I just pulled up, for example, a couple articles from the Militant in the 1940s writing about the UAW and their efforts to get the sliding scale of wages adopted, which they viewed were partially successful under Reuther. And I think we should understand this demand basically through the lens of the work they did in the immediately following period. And at this point, this demand was for a cost of living adjustment or escalator clause in union contracts, which was taken up and in fact won by a number of unions. Now, as a whole, the demand is to generalize this and have it throughout society, but I don't think it's anything as bizarre as the abolition of money, even by some backhanded means. It's, when there's mass inflation, and this sets workers in motion, that they should call for, in a contract or through legislation or elsewhere, that as inflation rises, so too should wages. And in fact, we have this in many contracts, and we have this in other countries even more so. So I think it's just very bizarre how this is now then interpreted to be something obviously other than what was intended. And the only way I can understand this criticism is through what were right-wing attacks on this, especially in the 70s, when it was claimed that if wages rose to keep up with inflation, then this would lead to an inflationary spiral and the destruction of the economy. And that's sort of a neoclassical economics and a sort of neoconservative anti-union thought, which I know cannot be intended. So I just wanted to speak briefly in defense of looking at the original materials from the time of how the demand for a sliding scale of wages was implemented and what people understood it meant, and and encourage folks to realize that I doubt the UAW under Walter Reuther was calling for the destruction of the monetary economy, even if inadvertently. That just simply cannot be what was intended or how people understood it.
Thank you, comrade. Mike, there aren't any other comrades with their hands up, so I suggest you respond to the questions now.
Okay. Where are we? Ian. Yes, I largely agree with what you have to say. It's not easy for us to think about how to work underground. The old official party had the KGB come in and sweep the King Street offices because for bugs, because they were regularly bugged by MI5, and we now know from the release of documents that the RCP of 1944 to 46, the Trotskyist organization, MI5 had full stenographic minutes of the meetings of their political bureau, which either means that it was bugged. I think most probably it was bugged, but it could equally be the case that it was that they had an agent on the political bureau of the RCP. The SWP elaborately operates semi-clandestinity. That they don't publish what's happening at their conference. They don't publish where their conference is happening. But the Spy Cops inquiry showed us that the cops, the special branch, has regular reports of what's happening in the SWP and far left organizations, and again, stenographic reports of what happens at SWP conferences, so that we have to be a bit cautious about if it comes to that we need to work clandestinely. The most fundamental thing is going to be mechanisms to publish overseas and to attempt to smuggle material into the country. It's also going to be necessary to fight hard against arguments for terrorism or urban guerrilla warfare and so on, which seem to be pretty much, not quite invariably, but very commonly, the work of agents provocateurs. And the extent to which we can say equally the head of the Bolsheviks parliamentary delegation was a police spy. But because the Bolsheviks actually made the parliamentary delegation do political work, didn't matter that the guy was a police spy. Because he had to actually do political work for the party in order to carry on functioning. Oh, yeah, splitting the army question. Engels' argument in Can Europe Disarm in favor of universal military training in schools. Engels' argument in his introduction to the class struggles in France, his 1890s edition of the Introduction to Class Struggles in France. He says we have to think of the socialist revolution as taking place not like the French Revolution with street demonstrations and barricades, but like the overthrow of paganism in ancient Rome, where the Diocletian and Galerius and these guys went after a mass pogrom of the Christians. And it turned out to be the case that there were so many Christians in the army that army mutinies brought down the regime. It's on Engels' part a bit of an overstatement, but his essential suggestion. And then the question is, what is the task of politics in clandestinity? Again, the task of politics in clandestinity is to get the political ideas out by publishing, to publish overseas and to smuggle the stuff in somehow by whatever means exists, to find, and of course this was the problem which the Trotskyists had. It's also a problem, again, Trotsky, we now know, and in fact the CIA knew at a very early stage that Trotsky believed that there were a lot of Trotskyists in Russia. The reason for that was because his correspondence with Russia was completely controlled by the KGB. He had agents run by the KGB in his actual, right at the center of the International Trotskyist Organization. So the ability to work clandestinely, it's a serious political problem. I don't know what the modern answer to it is. Ken's point, this relates, I guess, to Ken's point, how does the left communicate? Actually, when we talk about the 19th century guys, there's really quite high levels of print and high levels of relatively high levels of literacy in the urban working classes. And you can see that actually just the industrial archaeology. The guys who work in the factories, there's all these damn safety notices and so many fines. You will be fined 5 pence, etc., for not making your grade, etc., etc. The employer expects the workers the urban workers to a considerable extent to be literate. But if there isn't literacy, then it's a question of spreading stuff through print, but from print to there's sort of levels of this. When I was back in the Oxford IMG in the 1970s, because I became dissentient on aspects of national politics, I got moved from the student cell into the Cowley cell, and I worked with the Cowley comrades. The students basically stood at the factory gate and handed out A4 duplicated bulletins, of which the first 3 pages were stuff about what's going on in the plant, the current state of wage negotiations, speed up, victimizations. And the 4th page was something taken from the Red Weekly, which was our paper, or something more general. So that you start with, as it were, you've got a central paper, central organ, central forms of publication that enables people to take stuff and spread it. And people take stuff and spread it. Quite often it may be the case that people take stuff and spread it which you don't expect. So before my time in Cowley, the branch put out the leaflet, and the membership just came out on strike at midnight, called for a speaker from the International Marxist Group, which the comrades were not prepared for. They didn't expect to be in the leadership, because they weren't the official leadership of the trade union or anything like that. But that sense of that you set stuff in motion and it spreads. I flagged up earlier in this, the article which I wrote on this in 2013 has been translated without my anybody asking me into Spanish and into Indonesian. I don't know how it came to be translated into Indonesian. There's that sense of that you put stuff out, you spread it out, you spread the ideas, and then that comes back to the question of creating the conditions in which the armed forces will split, which is the Engels point. The spread of the ideas, the same with the US anti-war movement. You've got really quite small CPUSA, about 10,000, something like that. 1,500 of the American militant, and the other groups smaller than that. Some of the small Maoist groups. But the idea of the anti-war movement spread out from by not clandestine means, but quite a lot of it's sort of underground. Because the access to the public press and the access of the left in the public press is the United States is significantly worse. And the Democratic Republic. This is an interesting one, and it's an important and interesting one. My understanding is that in Marx and Engels in the 1840s, 1850s, the concept of the Democratic Republic is the regime which the working class will create, which holds the bourgeoisie in subordination. Having said that, in the 1880s, 1890s, we've got in the very early 1880s, in fact, Marx argues at the Brussels Congress of the International that Parliament is sovereign in Britain and the Netherlands, and in consequence, if you win the elections, you can just take over. Now, that's quite an radical misconception. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to say Marx was wrong on that. That's a radical misconception, because it fails to understand the role of the monarchy, which you have in both Britain and the Netherlands, fails to understand, and to which in both Britain and the Netherlands, the armed forces officers swear allegiance to the king or the queen, as the case may be, not to Parliament or the Constitution. And it fails to understand the role of the judicial power. I've referred to the judiciary inventing anti-union laws, and of course the 1906 Trade Disputes Act, the history of the 1960s and 1970s is to a considerable extent of the judges loopholing the Trade Disputes Act in order to find ways to make trade unions liable to employers for strikes, which is then taken up and adopted by Thatcher and co, but it's judicial legislation in the first place. So Marx, the idea of the Democratic Republic, Marx and Engels, Marx, not so much Marx, but very clearly Engels in the 1880s, writing about the United States, writes about the United States as, quote, a democratic republic. But it's obvious the United States is a republic, but it's not a democratic republic. You know? It's a mixed constitution, which has elements of democracy, which are the vote and freedom of speech and the right to bear arms and trial by jury, but large elements of aristocracy, which is the judicial power, and elements of monarchy, which is the presidency, the governors of the individual states, the mayors of the individual cities, the police chiefs, all of these things. When you have a one person officer, directly elected officers, is a form of monarchy. And so there's confusion about the Democratic Republic in the late 19th century, and that's reflected also in Kautsky in the Social Revolution and the day after the Social Revolution, that there's confusion, that he thinks of the democratic demands as being uncompleted demands of the bourgeois revolution. Excuse me. If you say that these are uncompleted demands of the bourgeois revolution, you're starting to say that Britain and the United States do not have a completed bourgeois revolution. What the fuck do you mean by that? As it's just plain bollocks. But then that becomes, it's sort of, okay, so we throw it out because it's all uncompleted demands of the bourgeois revolution. We have to somehow talk about the maximum program in some way without thinking of a period of transition. Soviets, okay, and we're not going to agree on this. The reality, my understanding of the situation essentially is that the victory of Soviets in Russia is an exceptional case. The reason for this exceptional case is that the Mensheviks and the right SRs, the pro-war parties, created Soviets as an extension of war production committees, which would support the more effective prosecution of the war in 1917, February 1917. And they left these institutions in existence in spite of the fact that the institutions, they didn't want the Tsar back. Nobody wanted the Tsar back. So it was comfortable to say that the soldiers shouldn't obey orders if they're not countersigned by the Soviet. Yeah, that's fine. Not for the revolutionaries, but the consequence of that is that they left these Soviets in existence. They didn't create any other democratic institutions because they expected to. They were afraid that they wouldn't win the votes in them. But the war, we had to win the war first. First win the war, and then we'll provide land reform. First win the war, and then we'll provide political democracy. Soviets, incidentally, people are saying in the chat, Soviets first arose spontaneously in 19. That's also not true. The Mensheviks proposed at their conference in 1904 that the workers' movement should create organizations like the British Trades and Labour Councils. And it's the Mensheviks who take the initiative in creating Soviets. Okay, the Petrograd Soviet and some of the other Soviets, Moscow Soviet, turn into potential dual power organizations. So what I'm saying here is, in fact, orthodox Trotsky. It's Trotsky in Lessons of October in 1923, and it's Trotsky in repeatedly writing on the Spanish Revolution. It's no good fetishizing the slogan of Soviets, because in order for Soviets to exist, they have to be Soviets of the whole class, and they have to include the right wing of the workers' movement. If they don't include the right wing of the workers' movement, they don't have the authority of the whole class. And that's very visible in the Chilean Cordones Industriales. It's very visible in the Workers' Council type formations in Portugal in 1974-76. It's not true of it's sort of the German and Austrian workers' councils. It do have the right wing in, but the right wing is fully in control, because the right wing cons the workers into voting for Soviets without parties. And the Soviets without parties then turn out to be Soviets which are controlled by the right wing, just as you find you never see an SWP appearing as representative of the SWP. They appear as representative of Unite Against Racism or of We Demand Change or whatever. So the social democracy, and indeed actually the Army Officer Corps, appeared as Soviet representatives of the soldiers, and the right wing of the SDP appeared as representatives of the trade unions, because they controlled the trade unions. And so we have Soviets without parties, which means Soviets without the left wing. So the point is not that we shouldn't have broad mass organizations. The point is not that we shouldn't have, we should have. I've been around when in the 70s Oxford Trades Council did very effective anti-fascist work, controlled by a combination of the Trotskyists and the hard-line wing of the Communist Party. A lot of the trades councils did great work, and of course that's why the TUC crushed them and reduced them to being radically subordinate to the full-time officials. Same way the combine committees. Yes, the working class can throw up, but what the working class throws up does not solve the problem of central political authority, and it does not solve the problem of the plan. That relates to Gershom's point, which I think is completely misconceived. It's not that the sliding scale of wages, the Scala Mobile in Italy and escalator clauses in Argentina operated fine. They operated, but the capitalist class controls how fast inflation goes. So that the Scala Mobile in Italy and the escalator clauses, and indeed the trade union cost of living increase clauses and so on and so forth, always wind up falling behind the rate of inflation. And that was already the case when people did get cost of living agreements in Britain in the inflation of 1974 to 76. And the solution, this is my point, the solution to this, okay, you can't leave the control of the inflation basket in the hands of the capitalist class. In order to make cost of living clauses work in the interests of the working class has to control what's in the inflation basket. And in point of fact, we've got the exact opposite, that the capitalist class has invented, quote, consumer price inflation, unquote, which excludes rent. Excuse me, how the hell does it come to be the case that the rises in the cost of living don't include rises in rent? And then when we look at the basket, actually, the CPI basket, if we had economists who did it, we find that the CPI basket is skewed in favour of the interests of the middle class. It's largely about consumer durables and other such things, and the weight of food goods and housing is out of it. Weight of food goods is marginalised, and so on and so forth, so that we get underreporting of the rate of inflation, the purpose of which is to render useless both wage bargaining for that and these escalator clauses or Scala Mobile arrangements, or etc., etc., etc. Okay, so if the working class then controls directly, have workers' councils, workers' control of the inflation basket. What that actually means is that by having workers' control of the inflation basket, we're deciding in the workers' council what every working class family should be getting. And we're deciding it in terms of material goods rather than cash money. We need it because it's R40. It's not just the case in relation to inflation at 10 to 20%, between 10 and 30%, which we had in Britain in the 1970s. It's R40 if you're talking about hyperinflation like Germany in 1923 or Zimbabwe in the early 2000s. So the point is that this is, there's two possibilities of what the sliding scale of wages means, and I don't think Trotsky meant a sticking plaster which will be demoralizing because it fails to keep up with the rate of inflation. It's the meaning is precisely that the working class should create Soviets in order to exercise control over the shopping basket. And that does entail, in reality, the replacement of money wages with rationing. Okay, the underlying issue, the other side of it, this was this was a slogan which was addressed to the circumstances of Russia in 1915-16, Britain in 1914-15, France, same period, Germany in 1917-18. The difference essentially is that in Russia, France, and in the Allied countries in the First World War, they didn't introduce effective measures of economic planning and rationing, with the result that there was not quite hyperinflation, but very serious inflation. And in Germany, they did in 1914 introduce Kriegssozialismus, economic planning for the purposes of the war. But in 1916, Hindenburg and Ludendorff took over the political government and smashed the planning set up in order to say we have to prioritize weapons, not food, weapons, more weapons. But of course, actually, Napoleon armies march on their stomachs. But I thought equally, industrial workers who produce weapons march on their stomachs as well. So that the Hindenburg-Ludendorff scheme for prioritizing weapons wrecked the German planning system and created in Germany, again, very, very serious inflation. Okay, so Trotsky put that in the centerpiece of the 1938 transitional program because he was expecting that sort of war. The same sort of thing would happen in 1939-45. He was expecting stabilized fronts. He was expecting stabilized fronts in the east as well as in the west very rapidly. Because his analysis of the First World War was that the fluidity of the Eastern Front was attributable to the low level of development of the forces of production. So he expected that the Eastern Front would stabilize like the Western Front, and that the Western Front would stabilize as it had in 1914-18. And there would be economic dislocation, inflation, etc., etc., etc. And in reality, what happened was that everybody introduced directive planning and rationing immediately in September 1939. And there was never a problem of serious inflation in the Second World War because it was all under high levels of directive planning control. So the purchase of the sliding scale demand. It was not just that the sliding scale demand is a demand which leads to war communism. It's which it does. Is it the demands of the economic demands of Trotsky's transitional program for transition from trade union struggles to war communism as it existed in 1918-19 in Russia. It's not just that; it's also it had no practical purchase on the situation of the 1939-45 war, and hence the point that the Trotskyists were marginalized. They weren't marginalized because the Stalinists killed lots of them. Stalinists killed a lot of them, but they were small to start with, and their political line had no purchase because it was adapted to the conditions of the First World War and not of the Second. So that's on the sliding scale of wages and hours. I don't think I'm misreading it at all. I think it's Gershom is misunderstanding. Gershom is completely misunderstanding this because this is a policy which has been, yes, it's fought for by Trotskyists in the 1940s and fought for by Trotskyists in the 1940s. It means merely what it means merely trade union agreements for wage escalators. But in the conditions of inflation which we had in the 1970s, trade union agreements for wage escalation fought for, won in Italy, won at the national level, and useless, led merely to demoralization. So it's not science fiction. Trotskyists were U.S. to Trotskyists were the United States. The canon says that the SWP has replaced the CPUSA as the mass party of the American working class. The SWP had 1,200 members. CPUSA at that moment in time had 60,000. It's just wildly unrealistic examples of official optimism. I think. There's one other thing, I guess, is just the democracy and the importance of political democracy in the program is not just a question of that we need to fight for democracy first. In the first place, actually, this Soviet experience shows that you can't do economic planning without political democracy. Secondly, we have mass workers' organizations and a load of small trot groups which serve merely as instruments for the capitalist class. And they serve merely as instruments for the capitalist class because they have no political democracy. They're managerialized. Just as the city communes were monarchized and merchant princeized in late feudalism, so the workers' organizations are monarchized and managerialized, and as a result, actually, the working class is blocked from effective organization. In order to overcome that, it's necessary to fight for political democracy. Jerry, mass slaughter. There weren't any fucking mass. The only mass Trotskyist organizations were in Vietnam, Indonesia, Bolivia, and the Vietnamese were split. The Bolivians, of course, were totally unaffected by the war, but then were split and rendered useless in the revolution of 1951-52. The Indonesians, they were still around and alive considerably later, but went down in the general massacre of Indonesian communists in 1965. That's it.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you also for answering all these questions and comments from the floor. Interesting discussion. Got a bit heated in the chat. I've referenced in the chat also Communist University to 2025, which starts at the end of July and goes on for a week. And Mike and other comrades will be there where comrades can continue the discussion. Thanks very, very much, Mike, also for answering all those questions in some detail. Next week, we're looking at the Party of Rear. Mike mentioned it in his introduction. Ian will spend some more time looking at the program and the party itself and how Marx was involved in writing said program and what it can teach us. Thank you very much, comrades. Thank you, Mike. And